regarding one of the great men of the past generation, the immediate past generation, Rabbi Avraham Yeshayahu Karelit, who is known to us as the Chazon Ish. The personality of the Chazon Ish and his whole demeanor in life was that he saw himself as a hidden person, as a secret person. So as we will see in a few moments, he published his works anonymously without any name. He never held any official position in Jewish life. And he never saw himself as being a public person, even though the truth of the matter is that he had more influence on the Jewish public in the years, especially in his later years in Eretz Israel, than almost any other figure of that generation. But he never saw himself that way. And because he never saw himself that way, a great deal of the story of his life is also not known. It's hard to fathom because of the fact that he was such a hidden person. Nevertheless, because of his greatness, and because at one and the same time being this hidden secret person, he was at the same time a tremendously prolific writer and correspondent. Many, many letters from him, and many poems and all sorts of literary things that he wrote. And so you can piece together, and there have been a number of very good biographies, especially in Hebrew, of his life and of his time. He himself always felt that all of us are miraculous beings, but he felt that he was an especially miraculous being because his mother was a woman that all of her life was sickly and ill, and when she was married, after having misfortunes with a number of her children that were either born stillborn or died within the first year of life, mother lost 6 children that way. The doctor told her that she should never become pregnant again, that it was a sakona for her personal well-being, and the doctors also felt that there was some genetic imbalance that would prevent her from having children that reach maturity. It's interesting that, just as a note of comparison, so to speak, that the Chidushe Harim, the famous Rabbi Meir Alter, the first Ger Rebbe, he and his wife also had a large number of children. They had 13 children, none of whom survived because of this genetic imbalance, except for the father of the Sfat Emes, who lived to marry and father the Sfat Emes, and then he also died in his 20s. So there was something in the family. So she was advised not to have any children. His father and mother did not accept the advice of the doctors. They lived in a small town in Lithuania called Kosove, which was not known for its medical center. And generally speaking, the art of medicine in Russia in the 1800s was even inferior to what existed in the rest of the world, which by our standards is extremely primitive. In any event, they prayed, and they felt that God would grant their prayer. And not only was the Chazon Ish born and lived a long life, but she had 9 children afterwards, all of whom lived. So she was pregnant. She gave birth to 15 children, 6 of whom died. 9 children who survived to maturity, and she herself died in her 90s. And she always said that she said 2 things, which shows you the attitude of righteous Jewish women. She said, number 1, that God wanted her to appreciate the fact of having a child and raising a child. And many times people take all the gifts of God for granted, as we all feel that we're entitled. You don't need a particular license to be a parent. And so therefore she said that the Ribono Shel Olam, God wanted to impress upon her the gift. So if one would have, God forbid, such an experience of 6 children and then one has a child, and the child is raised and is grown, so then naturally that's different than a person that would have had, let's say, a 7th child in the family where all 6 are healthy and grown also. The second thing she said was that when she prayed to God, so as long as she asked him for a child, she asked him for something special already. Right? As long as he's giving, right? You got to give her a miracle, so that she didn't ask for a regular. She asked for a special. Amazing insight into how Jews conversed with the Ribono Shel Olam. When I read that story, that anecdote, I thought that really that's a medrash regarding our mother Hannah and the birth of the prophet Samuel, because there also she was a woman that was a barren woman who could not have any children, who biologically, medically was precluded from having children, and who devoted her life to prayer to God that he grant her a child. But not only to grant her a child, she demanded that if God was going to do the favor, that he should give her a special child. And that's the Pasuk, El Anar Hazeh Hispalolti. I prayed for this son, that he should be Shmuel Hanavi, he should be the great prophet Samuel, he should be the Jewish people, the world should have a benefit from it. And that trait of our mother Hannah is one that has been imbued genetically within Jewish women throughout the ages. So that we don't pray for small miracles, right? As long as you got to talk to the boss, right? So then ask him for a big raise, right? If a person's afraid to come to the boss, can ask him for a raise, okay? But as long as you got in and he gave you an appointment and you're talking to him, so ask him already. Don't ask him for $100 a week, ask him for $500 a week. That was her attitude. And therefore she felt almost as a given that the child who God granted to her was going to be a special child, as he was going to be a special person. And the irony of God's world, which is inscrutable and beyond us, the Chazon Ish himself was childless. So even though he himself, especially in his later life, when he became such a legendary figure, people would go to him to ask him to intercede on their behalf. And there are recorded so many incidents of people whom he helped cure, and childless couples who then had a child, and all sorts of yeshuas, almost like the greatest of Hasidic rebbeim. But he himself was childless. He was born in 1879 in this little town of Kosovo in Lithuania. His father was the Lev in the town, and there was a small yeshiva in town, a yeshiva for boys from 11 to 15. In Lithuania, the system was that there was what they call a yeshiva ktana. So the cheder was until the boy was 10 or 11. After the cheder, those that, for either economic or intellectual reasons, would not continue. Most Jewish males never had a formal education past age 11. And most Jewish females had no formal education whatsoever. But a boy that showed promise, and that somehow the parents could scrape together the money, etc., would continue to a yeshiva ktana, which, as I mentioned, was from 11 to 14 to 15. And those that then showed promise after that, it really was a widowing process. They were the ones that went on to yeshiva Gdola, to the major yeshivas in Lithuania. So that by the time we come to the major yeshivas in Lithuania, we are speaking about a very small percentage but a very high caliber quality percentage. It's not to, I don't mean to demean today's yeshiva student, but that's not our system today. Our system is universal education. And because of the society, it must be. If a boy does not go to yeshiva high school, if a girl doesn't go to yeshiva high school, we're not talking here about knowledge. We are simply speaking about the likelihood of remaining Jewish and not being assimilated is very small if he does not have what today has become a minimum Jewish education. And if he doesn't go on to yeshiva gedola in his till he's 20, till he's 21, till he gets married, so you really are you're really running risks because of the nature of the society. That was not true, at least in that part of the world exactly at that time, because the home and the street and the society were much more supportive of basic Jewish life. Therefore, the task of the yeshiva was not to make a Shomer Shabbos out of the person. The task of the yeshiva was to make a Godel, was to make a great man in Torah, with all the intellectual ramifications that implies. That's not necessarily the task of our yeshivas today. The task of our yeshivas is to make balabatim, to make rabbonim, to make machanechim, to make gedolei Torah. We have to make everything. And therefore, to a certain extent, our task may be easier, but to another extent, it's much harder, because you have you really have many, many different goals, and you have to do it with all one curriculum and one way of doing it. And the one curriculum and one way of doing it is to produce the Godel. So you have to hope somehow that you don't turn everybody else off on the way to producing the one Godel or the 5 Gedolim that are at the end, and the other 95 guys who are going to go out in the world and do other things. They also have to be part of the picture. But this was not meant to be a lecture about today's yeshivas. But in order to have an understanding of the Chazon Ish and where the times that he lived in, it's important, because as we'll see later, I don't know in this lecture, but certainly in the next lecture, the Chazon Ish was an enormously creative, original, progressive person in his views on Jewish education, in his views on the yeshivas, and the views of learning. He was a nonconformist. And in his time, he, in spite of his self-effacement, he was a semi-controversial person because of these views. He had a private rebbe. His father hired for him a private teacher. It's interesting. His father hired for him the same private teacher who was the father's private teacher when he was a child. His father said as a joke that the rebbe had the ability to hit also as Beno, to hit the father and the son, to discipline 2 generations. He was a very famous Rebbe. Mesha Tuvia was his name, and he was a Volozhin or Talmud. He was a student of the Netziv Volozhin. He himself was a great Talmud Chacham, but he was a Rebbe for children, which was a common occupation even of great scholars who had no other way of making a living, and who taught in that fashion. He saw immediately that the Chazon Ish was the wonder child, not the regular child. And the Chazon Ish combined in himself a tremendous intellect. He was a genius, and he had if not a photographic memory, an enormously retentive memory, certainly a tremendous associative memory. But his main quality was his ability to concentrate for very, very long periods of time. And that is not an easy thing. The story is told that the Sfas Emes, the great Chassidic Rebbe, the grandson of the Chidush Yarim, the Polish Minister of Education, once visited him. And he said to him, "Rabbi, I hear that you're a great man, a great genius, tens of thousands of people come to you. Tell me, in what lies your greatness?" So the Polish Minister of Education was pulling his leg, right? He thought he would tell him he's a miracle worker, a wonder worker, he speaks with God. It was something that the Pole could mock. And the Sfas Emes told him, he said, there are times when I can concentrate for hours on one subject. That's my greatness, that I can concentrate for hours consecutively on one subject. The Chazon Ish had that ability. The Chazon Ish writes in one of his books that he had one problem regarding Eruvin, and he said he spent 45 hours consecutively on that problem. He slept a few hours, but he concentrated on the problem for 45 hours consecutively in order to understand the Gemara and the Rishonim and come to the proper decision as to how to make that Eruv. There are not many people who can concentrate on one thing for 45 hours, no matter how fascinating or no matter how industrious they are. That was really the hallmark that differentiated. I mean, thank God the Jewish people have always had geniuses. They've always had smart people. They're always, what made him so special is above everyone. And we're talking a generation of great people. What made him so outstanding, even though he engaged in this self-effacement, was the fact that he had this uncanny, unbelievable ability, power of concentration, to be able to sit on something. And that his teacher saw when he was a young child yet. By the time he was 10, 11 years old, it was not uncommon for him to stay up all night working on one problem, on one thesis, on one piece of Gemara. And he used to, he is quoted as having said that in order to figure out a hard piece of Gemara, he said, you have to stay up all night. He didn't see it to be a wondrous matter or something that was worthy of special compliment. This was combined always with as it almost is traditionally with the great men of Israel, with a body that wasn't as strong as the will. He was a sickly child. Well, most of the children in Eastern Europe and Lithuania were sickly children. And he was weak, and even though he did live into his late 70s, but he nevertheless, all of his life suffered from ailments, painful ailments. But again, his will was so strong that it was almost discounted as far as he was concerned. When he was bar mitzvah, so he delivered the traditional bar mitzvah speech, at least of his time. I don't know of our time, but of his time. And when he concluded it, and the assembled guests, which included many great rabbis, etc., heard it and were duly impressed, he took upon himself a vow that he told his brother, Meir Karelitz. I had the privilege of meeting and talking to the Chazon Ish's brother, Meir Karelitz, who was the secretary of the Chafetz Chaim and who was one of the most interesting Jews of that generation. Fascinating person. So he took a vow in which he said, I now subscribe my entire life to learn Torah lishma, to learn Torah only for the sake of learning Torah. And that vow is what precluded him from ever holding any rabbinic position or any public position. And that vow was part of the personality that brought him to this anonymity. Now, Chazon Ish, Rav Avram Yishai Karelitz, was very different. He never had a rebbe. He learned on his own. Self-made person. Never went to yeshiva. So in today's world, that's frowned upon. And maybe in today's world, one cannot make it without going to yeshiva. But in that period of time, there were a number of great Jews, great rabbinic scholars, great Talmidei Chachamim, who did it on their own. They were self-taught. When he was 14 years old, he traveled to Brisk in order to learn Torah from Reb Chaim, from the great Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. After the yeshiva in Volozhin was closed, So Reb Chaim succeeded his father as the Rav in Brest-Litovsk, and he didn't have an official yeshiva there, but what happened was that the brilliant, the leading young men in Torah came to spend time with him and to learn Torah from him. So it was like an unofficial yeshiva, but it was well known that you traveled to Brisk to Reb Chaim. When he was 14, the chazon went, but he only stayed a week, and then he left. He never explained why. Many explanations have been given by others, but since he didn't tell us why, then any sort of explanation would be pure conjecture. There's no reason to conjecture. But that, again, was part of his makeup, is that he had no Rebbe and that he went to no yeshiva. So he said to himself, he writes this in letters later, it says in Pirkei Avos, it says in the Ethics of the Fathers, Asei lecha rav. You're supposed to make for yourself a teacher. Since he didn't have a teacher, how would he fulfill it? So he said to himself that his teacher was the Gaon of Vilna. He said, Asei lecha rav doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a teacher who's alive, but that you have to have a teacher. You have to have someone whose method and curriculum and leadership you follow in Torah. And his teacher was the Gaon of Vilna. Let me just quote for you a small segment of a short essay that he wrote about the Gaon of Vilna. I mentioned to you before, the Chazon Ish was a tremendously prolific writer and a poetic writer. Some of the most beautiful prose and poetry that we have of that generation was written by him. His mastery of the Hebrew language and his poetic soul are often overlooked because we think of him only as a man of halacha, when in reality he had this facet as well. So he said as follows, he says, the Gaon of Vilna is in a straight line, which, if you will follow, is Moshe, Ezra, Rebbe, Rav Ashi, the Ruth, the Rambam, the Beis Yosef. He says, then it's the Gaon of Vilna. That's the line. There are, the example that he gave is that there's an express train that makes 10 stops or 15 stops, coast to coast. So it stops at the main stations. And then there's a local that's going the same place, and it follows the same tracks, but it makes 50 stops or 70 stops on the same train. He said in the train of Torah, in the railroad of Torah, there are 10 stops, of which the Gaon of Vilna is one of the stops. He said, on the local, right, so it includes everybody, every Jew ever wrote a sefer, every Jew ever contributed to Jewish scholarship, every Rosh Yeshiva, everyone that taught, they're all a local stop. But there's an express stop that you have to stop there. So he says that was Moshe, that was Ezra, that was Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, that was Rav Ashi, that was the Ruth, that was the Rambam, that was Rabbi Yosef Karo, and he says that the other last stop was the Gaon of Vilna. And he said, therefore, that the Gaon of Vilna has to be considered in the same level as one of the Rishonim, one of the early great scholars. And therefore, he says, the Gaon of Vilna in many places disagrees with rabbis that were generations before him, which is something that is not common and not even accepted. And sometimes he says he disagrees even with the Rif and with the Rambam, because the Gaon is of that stature. And therefore he says that the Gaon was his Rebbe. The Gaon was his Rebbe. And because of the fact that the Gaon was his Rebbe, so we find it throughout his Sforim. He himself writes later that until he was 42 years old, he never took it upon himself to disagree with the conclusion of the Gaon of Vilna. But he said from the age of 42 onwards, he said there are a number of places where he took upon himself the temerity to disagree with the Gaon of Vilna and stop. because of his own logic and because of what he thought was correct. He also was a person of tremendous spirituality in terms of prayer to God. He has a sentence that says that in every Jew's heart, he says in every person's heart, not just every Jew, every person's heart, he says, there is a harp. And he says if one can learn to play the harp, so then God responds to it. If you press the right buttons, you get the telephone line connects. And he says the ultimate of prayer is to be able to converse with God as one converts, Kaviochel, with another human being. To tell God what's on your mind, what's bothering you. He says that was the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. As Moshe spoke to God, and God spoke to Moshe as two people who are friends, who are intimate with each other, speak to each other. He said that's the measure of prayer. The measure of prayer is to be able to speak to God directly. To be able to speak to God in a fashion that God responds that way. He says that's why God calls the Jewish people Yeled Shashuim, a child at play. A child is guileless. You speak to a child will tell you everything. Child doesn't know yet all of the fancy things that we cover ourselves with when we become more mature. So he'll tell you what's bothering him. A child falls, so the child cries. Right? He's 3 years old, he falls down, he cries. He didn't hurt himself, doesn't make any difference. He cries. An adult will fall and feel tremendous pain, but he will not cry. Why doesn't he cry? Because of defense mechanisms that we have built up, because the cover that we have built up on ourselves to mask ourselves prevents us. We are under control. He says the Don Shalom speaks to man, God wants us to be like a child at play. When we speak to God, we have to be guileless. We have to be direct, open. Therefore, he said that someone once asked him, what nusach should he daven? Because should he daven the nusach of the Gaon of Vilna, or nusach Ashkenaz, or nusach Ari, or the nusach Sfard, the different types of nuschos that exist in prayer. So he said one can pray in any nusach as long as he prays. As long as he prays from his heart, he said. Praying from one's heart, that's the best nusach. And that strength of his in prayer was one of his great hallmarks and one of his great qualities. From the age of 14 till 17, for 3 years, he literally locked himself in his own base medrash, in his own room to study. Studied day and night, again, without anyone. So we're talking here about a teenage youngster. And he writes on that period of time that he never again in his life, he said, had the taste in Torah that he had during those 3 years of splendid isolation. In those 3 years when he devoted himself completely to Torah. When he was 17, he journeyed for the first time to Vilna. Vilna was the Yerushalayim Delita, was the Jerusalem of that age. And when he came to Vilna, this is in 1896, when he came to Vilna, there he met for the first time the great Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzinski, who was, in many respects, the role model for the chazon ish, because Reb Chaim Ozer was also not a product of a yeshiva, a very original genius, very different type of person, and who by his simple presence in the community became the overwhelming influence in the community. He was not the rabbi of Vilna, and later on in life, after the First World War, another rabbi was elected in competition, so to speak. Reb Chaim Ezer wasn't even elected the Rav in Vilna. But Reb Chaim Ezer was not only the Rav in Vilna, Reb Chaim Ezer was the leading Jewish rabbinic figure of that time. And his influence, he and the Chofetz Chaim were the leaders of Lithuanian and northern Polish Jewry, certainly of the world of the Misnagdim, almost till the Second World War. And he was extremely impressed by Reb Chaim Ezer. Reb Chaim Ezer became a hero of his. Later on, we'll see that when he moved to Vilna permanently, Reb Chaim Ezer is the one that saw to it that he should be able to continue to study and develop and become the great leader that he did. When he was 19, he began writing his works, even though they would not be published till much later. And when he was 22 years old, we find the first time that he appears in public, there was a magazine, a journal called the Hapeles. Peles in Hebrew means a balance scale. And it was during this time, there were tremendous pressures on traditional Jewry from the Maskilim, from the so-called enlightened people who published magazines, journals, newspapers in Hebrew, and used this as a source of ridicule and contention against traditional Jewish life. The traditional Jews were slow to respond, but eventually they did respond. One of their responses was the Hapeles, which was an Orthodox journal. The Yisrael Salanta was originally behind it, and it published for a number of years. And in the Hapeles, we find, when he was 22 years old, in 1901, we find already a letter from him, and it was signed Aleph Yud Shin, meaning Ish. That's the abbreviation of his name. His name was Avraham Yeshayahu. Aleph is Avraham, Yud Shin was Yeshayahu. That's later on he'll call his Sefer, Chazon Ish. His name is hidden in it. The word Ish, which literally means a man, is the acrostic for his name. And he signed the letter as Ish Mikasava, Avram Yeshaya, that comes from Kasava, from this town. And the shaila that he discussed, the problem that he discussed, had to do with the calendar that came out in 1901. In 1901, there was a difference of opinion as to whether the month of Cheshvan would have 30 days or 29 days. And that was based on a halachic disagreement regarding the calendar. Now, the Chazon Ish was one of the great mathematicians and astronomers that the Jewish world had. And here, when he was 22 years old, he interceded in a matter that great rabbis had a dispute regarding. And he, through his decisive writing, decided in this article what the correct calendar was. It gained great notoriety, but nobody knew who wrote it. And maybe it was better that no one knew who wrote it, because they would say a 22-year-old little guy from a little town, I mean, who's he to mix into this argument that the Poltava Rav was involved in and other great Rabbonim were involved? Who was he to become involved in it? But the article itself was written so well, and the logic and everything that was involved was so clear that it carried the day. And from then on, the London, the scholarly community, always looked to see what Ish was going to put out, even though they were not aware until much later. He was able to hide his identity for a number of decades before he finally was revealed as the author of these works. Now, I want to point out to you an interesting facet of his personality. The Chazon Ish lived in a time when the Jewish world, the traditional Jewish world, was being destroyed. First, there was Haskalah. In 1905 was the first Russian Revolution. In the first Russian Revolution, which run by the socialists and the communists, in which the Tsar was successful in crushing, an enormous amount, a disproportionate amount of the leadership of the revolution, as far as the anarchists or the socialists or the communists were concerned, were Jews. And many of the Jews were yeshiva Jews. Boys who had gone to the yeshiva, who had tremendous idealism within them, and who were swept up. It's hard for us to become enthusiastic about communism 75 years or 70 or 75 years after Lenin, because we see the bankruptcy of it, and we see the 100 million corpses. We see what has happened. But at the turn of the century, the enthusiasm, the idealism for these ideas is beyond our ability to imagine, and especially in the Jewish world, and especially in the yeshiva Jewish world. When Lenin took over in 1917, Lenin and Trotsky, so they had a special section for Jewish affairs, the Yevtsekis, who were the most ruthless and cruel persecutors of religion generally, and of the Jewish religion particularly. And the three leading members in the hierarchy were all yeshiva students. And this plague, this epidemic, swept the Jewish world. How should it be fought? The Chazon Ish had a very uncharacteristic attitude to it, and it's something that we should bear in mind today. Also, I think that it's almost a harbinger. He writes as follows. He said there were many in the yeshiva world who fought against the socialists and the communists with terrible curses, with broadsides in the papers, with condemnations, with anathema. And he said that he saw that what happened was that a great proportion of them eventually became socialists. Eventually they succumbed themselves. He said the only way, and the way he said that I encouraged, was not to debate the matter with them, not to curse them, not to push them away. He said, but to do positive things, to study Torah, to show the positiveness of Torah life, not to be involved in the debate with them. It was interesting because the Chassam Sofer writes the same thing in his Chuvas regarding reform. The Chassam Sofer said that he never wrote against Reform Judaism. He never wrote any articles. He said because that's all sterile. That all is counterproductive. He said the only thing that he did against Reform Judaism is he built the Preshborg, he built the yeshiva. He did positive things. And we will find that throughout his lifetime, the Chazon Ish will have to deal later with the secular Zionist movement, will have to deal with many, many problems. That was his confirmed policy, was not to engage in the debate that only would give vent to his spleen and cause problems, but instead to be positive. When he was 23, he married the daughter of a very wealthy textile merchant who lived in the town of Constantine, which is Lithuania on the Prussian border, right next to Germany. Kidan, right next to the Prussian border. His father-in-law was a well-known Talmud Chacham, but he was a very wealthy textile merchant who traveled to South Africa and at that time to many other exotic places in the business. And his daughter was very good in business. The Chazon Ish's wife was the Rebbitzin of the Chazon Ish was a very strong businesswoman. And because of the fact that the father was in business, and because of the fact that the daughter had a reputation for business, so the Chazon Ish's family initially was not very happy with the shidduch. but he was determined to go through with it, which he did. And he married her, and after their marriage, in other words, almost the first 30 years of their marriage, she supported him through running textile stores, textile shops in towns wherever they lived. She had a store, and she was well known as a very astute businesswoman and as a person to be reckoned with. When they moved to Israel, and we'll talk about it later, when he came to Eretz Yisrael in the 1930s, in Eretz Yisrael he would not allow her to go into business. Apparently he knew the secret of, how to make a small fortune in Israel, right? She would not allow her to go into business. And for the rest of his life, from the time that he was in Eretz Yisrael till his death, his sole financial support came from the sale of his books. But while he was in Europe, all the money for his books went for charitable purposes. He never took any of the money himself. When he came to Israel, though, his wife no longer operated the store. Most of the customers of the store were non-Jewish. And Chazon Ish used to, the biographies of him at least say that he would visit the store every day for a period of time, that he had given her certain rules by which the store should be run, so that it wouldn't impinge even in the gray area of monetary matters of perhaps transgressing, God forbid, on any of the laws of the Shulchan Aruch. And that when he would come into the store, the non-Jewish people, the non-Jewish customers would know that, let's say he came in every morning at 10 o'clock, they would all wait till he came, because they felt that his words of blessing, or his greeting them, which he unfailingly did, that he was a holy man, and that therefore it increased the business. When he found out that is what the non-Jewish people, they were waiting for the chazon ish to come, so he said that then therefore that was an unfair competitive edge that his wife had, because they wouldn't go to the other textile stores because they were waiting. They didn't come to the store because of the yarn or the prices. They came because of the chazon ish. So then he stopped going to the store altogether. There are legends, it's hard to prove, but there are legends that all of the customers or all of the wholesalers who sold or bought or dealt with the chazon ish's wife, if they had any monetary problems there, or with any discussion, they always took it to the din Torah, to the chazon ish. And that the majority of the time she lost by him. The further legend is that once there was a great deal of money involved and he decided against her, and he saw that she was upset. So there was a large sum of money involved. So he said to her, of what value is life? What value is money? He said, if the money that you have is somebody else's, you're not really entitled to it. It's of no value. There's nothing to be aggravated about. And because of this behavior, so his in-laws and the other members of his wife's family thought that she had married very poorly. They said he was a bottlin. He never was going to earn a living. He was locked up all day learning. He left all the responsibility to her. And especially during this time when the Torah student was not held in universal respect and awe, in the time of the Enlightenment and the time of the Socialist Revolution, the time of secular Zionism, when the yeshiva student was to a great extent the butt of all jokes. And here she was married to this man, and not only that, but when people came to him because of his erudition, he unfailingly decided against their store or against their self-interest. So the family didn't recognize him. They didn't see who they really had. They didn't really appreciate him. The chazon ish's penchant for anonymity was even from the family. He hid his greatness. And he wrote in one of his notes, he says that when people are aware of another person's greatness or talent, he said the mere knowledge places that greatness and talent in danger. And therefore, he said, if one can hide it to the extent that one can, that was the safest way to safeguard it. That was his life. That's the way he lived. That's the way he always thought of himself. In 1912, he published his first sefer called Chazon, and the sefer was published in Vilna, and on the title page it had no name of an author, and not only that, it was a sefer that had no rabbinic approbations. There were no haskomas to the sefer. Usually when a book of halacha is printed, and don't forget this is not just a book of essays or of theoretical matter, it's a book of psak halacha, a book to decide halachic matters. And therefore, especially in that time, even today, one doesn't print such a book unless he has a letter of approbation from some well-known rabbinic figure. And here the Chazon Ish, again, in order to preserve his anonymity, published the book without any rabbinic approbations, without any haskomos. So this book came out. But the book was so great that it carried itself. And the Chazon Ish became a respected authority in halacha, even though people did not know who the author was. It's interesting that in Bnei Brak today, in the area where the Chazon Ish lived, there are a number of great Talmidei Chachamim who have published extensively over decades, and they have published in anonymity. But the Chazon Ish himself said that the Yetzer Hara is a very smart character. And he says the greatest evil that can befall a person is to make sure that his anonymity is known. And there are people, look how anonymous I am, right? Look how modest I am, right? Look how self-effacing I am. So we'll see later that when the Chazon Ish was discovered, so to speak, when the cover was blown, when the anonymity was no longer so anonymous, so then all questions of anonymity disappeared, because then it would be a show. It wouldn't be real anymore. It wouldn't serve the purpose. Now, this person whom people said was a Batlin and who knew nothing of the world and who was holed up in halacha, in 1913, October 8th, 1913, was the day of the great Beilis trial. Mendel Beilis was a Russian Jew who was accused in a blood libel. And not only did the Russian government frame him, the Russian police, etc., but because of it, the Russian government called a special session of parliament, so to speak, how to deal with the Jewish persecution of Christians. You hear? Bizarre is the problem of how, it's like Cardinal Gwen, right? It's all the Jews are doing it. So we see that in the history is accurate, but it can be very depressing because one sees that very little progress is made. In any event, Beilis was defended especially by Rabbi Yaakov Mazeh, Rabbi Jacob Mazeh, who was the rabbi of Moscow. He was the official rabbi of Moscow. And most of the official rabbis in Russia did not have close ties to the Orthodox community. But he did, Mazeh did. Mazeh was a great man in many respects. The family, Massey, Raymond Massey, the actor, that's the family. Mazeh stands, it's the Hebrew acronym, Mem Zion Aleph Hey Mizera Aaron HaKohen. It's a family of Kohanim, and they claim that they have direct proof of their descent all the way back to Aaron. That's why they call themselves Mazeh, right? And that's the name Massey. So Mazeh defended Bayless. Mazeh, however, told the rabbis that it would be good if someone would write to the Russian Minister of Justice a defense of Judaism against the absurdity of the accusations made against Bayless particularly, but against the Jewish people and the Jewish religion generally. And the chazon ish, who was not appointed to it, he heard that was Maz's recommendation, and he wrote a 26-page letter that he had translated into Russian and wrote to the Minister of Justice. That is one of the clearest and most erudite expositions of the Jewish attitude towards life and towards murder and towards the taking of life and the absurdity of the charges that were made against the Jewish people and against Bayless. So again, you have here a facet of the personality that shows what kind of person he was, because here you have somebody that for years sits in a room and studies Torah and apparently has nothing to do with the world, and is the last person that you would perhaps think would write such a thing. And he wrote the main defense. In fact, these letters were found in the Russian archives of the trial, that the justice minister took it under advisement. Bayless, by the way, by a miracle, was acquitted. The evidence was so flimsy and the frame-up was so apparent that even the Russian government couldn't go through with it. And Bayless was acquitted. But it's the chazon ish's brief, so to speak, amicus curiae, his friend of the court brief on the entire subject matter of life and murder and respect for life, that's part of the Judaism that appears in the file. And I think that, to me at least, that's a remarkable revelation of the person. It's an unusual facet that he would undertake that. In 1914, the World War broke out. As I mentioned, the town Constantine was close to the German border, and the town was ruined by German shelling, and they all fled. Chazon Ish and his wife fled. The father-in-law's textile business was ruined. The store was destroyed. The inventory was burned. And they fled to a little town called Stavitz. In Stavitz, there was a small yeshiva, and the head of that small yeshiva was Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, the great Rabbi Henkin, who later was the rabbi of Ezra Storer here in the United States, who was himself, again, just as Reb Chaim Ezer, he was also self-educated, a genius, a tremendous Talmud Chacham, but you couldn't peg him. You couldn't put him into, and a great holy man, as perhaps the Jewish people have not had such a person in many a decade. And Rabbi Henkin himself has two articles regarding the Chazon Ish. One was published in the Hapardes, in the Rabbinic Journal, and at the time of the death of the Chazon Ish. But there was an earlier article which he published in his own Sefer, Lev Ivra. So he writes that the first time he met the Chazon Ish fled to Stavitz. So he said he met this person, and the person made no impression upon him as being a specially gifted or erudite scholar, because the Chazon Ish was the genius of self-effacement. So he said to him, "What do you do?" So he answered very little. So he says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Would you like to learn?" Rav Henkin said to him. He said, "Yeah, I would like to learn." So Rav Henkin sat down and learned with him Mishnayos. He learned because he figured that, So he learned Mishnayos. He said after he was learning with him for 3 minutes, he said even though the Chazon Ish tried to hide it, he saw that he's dealing with somebody here. And then they became lifelong friends and lifelong correspondents. Two really kindred spirits in terms of genius, in terms of influence, and two people who also, Rav Henkin never held an official position here in America. Rav Henkin never was a Rav, but nobody of worth in this country ever did anything without speaking to Rav Henkin. just as no one in Israel of worth would do anything without speaking to the Chazon Ish. So again, the circumstances of the war threw them together in this little town of Stavitz, and that's where he found himself. That's the first part of his life. The second part of his life, which will deal with the rest of the war and the period of Europe between the wars, will be the subject of the next lecture. And then the third lecture on the Chazon Ish will be from the time he comes to Eretz Yisrael until the time of his death. Rabbi Avram Yeshayahu Karelitz, the Chazon Ish, returned to Vilna after the First World War. Now, Jewish Vilna after the First World War was, as the rest of European Jewry, fairly much in shambles. And the task of rebuilding, both physically and spiritually, the Jewish community was a very foreboding and difficult one. Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, who was the head of the Jewish community in Vilna, in fact, the head of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe, he attempted to enlist the Chazon Ish of Avram Yeshayahu Karelitz to help him in his public efforts to rebuild the Jewish community. But the search for anonymity, for privacy, which was so much of his life, of Rabbi Avram Yeshayahu Karelitz's life, still was so strong that he took no public active roles. Though he did take a much greater role behind the scenes, and in many matters was really the catalyst for events that occurred in Vilna and occurred throughout Jewish Lithuania and Poland. The Chazon Ish had certain attitudes and beliefs that he was very staunch about. His belief in the study of Torah as being the supreme goal was so strong that, to a certain extent, he never allowed himself to be counted in the camp of the Musar yeshivas, of the yeshivas which taught Musar, encouraged the study